One thing that you said that stood out was that free will and choice are different. So can you expand a little bit on that? Because I think like a lot of people get stuck, like I'm a little stuck there in understanding that.
Well, part of it is first of all to notice that, you know, it's just a general thing in Western cultures in particular to hold the notion of free will, choice, and decision as if they're the same thing. And they're not the same thing. They actually represent three different things. Um, for example, I hear people use the word decision and use the word choice as if they were interchangeable. And the way in which you might characterize the difference between, say, decision and choice is that a decision is to cut away, decide, right? Side is like the same root as suicide or genocide or something, right? So to cut away, to essentially cease those as options. Whereas choice doesn't necessarily need you to treat it as a cutting away. It could also be treated as essentially creating of a new response. Like if I was presented with three options and said, which one of these do you do? Well, I get to make the move of, well, those three options aren't what I want. I want this option. And this is what option 4 looks like. Tristan Harris talks about it as things not on the menu, right? So to be able to have an imagination that is inclusive enough to really think about a broader set of options than that which was presented, things which could genuinely be win-win choices or win-win-win-win on and on, right? That, to think about choice from the flexibility of one's imagination and to develop capacities to broaden the scope of one's capacity to imagine or to have intelligence and apply that imagination is much more the domain in which choice would be held rather than to cut away options, to as often create new options and then to select those. But the notion of free will as a thing is actually sort of a conflation of as I said, two words. The notion of freedom, as if it was essentially an absence of constraints, is largely a reference to the notion of determinism. So, in other words, to say not determined, right? To say something is free is to say that it's not determined by prior circumstances, but this is largely a result of the conflation between science and mathematics. So mathematics may be a great language with which to represent scientific concepts, but the scientific concepts are causal concepts, whereas mathematical concepts are logical ones. And logic has a sense of defined all the way down to the scale of essentially nothing, of zero. And so in effect, they're perfectly specified. But causation is not perfectly specified. In other words, you can say, well, this antecedent, broadly speaking, leads to this consequent, broadly speaking. But I don't necessarily need to know the details of every little thing about the antecedent or the consequent to know that relationship exists. Whereas to say that something is deterministic is to say that actually there's no possibility that you do know the details all the way down to the infinitely small, and that there's essentially a direct relationship in the sense of logic of this entails that. So to speak of freedom in this sense is essentially to have first of all, the idea that life and reality is deterministic and that somehow or another I'm going to be outside of this determinism. Of course, most philosophers would reject that flat out because they've already assumed that reality is deterministic. But if I actually look at what's been discovered and things like I hesitate to mention this because it's become such a trope, but the idea that objective potentiality exists. The notion of potentiality as being objective. And again, you notice that this language, I'm quoting other articles when I say objective potentiality or the notion that objective potentiality exists is coming out of the literature of quantum mechanics, which is unfortunately probably some of the most confused philosophical literature ever written. There's so much stuff that people hinge their philosophy on top of that, and it's unfortunate because there is some deep things that are being observed there, which is the idea that objective randomness, or that there's a notion of hard randomness, that there are things that are real but are inherently unpredictable, and that in this sense of being unpredictable, they're unconditioned. They are, in a sense of not being determined, they are free, right? But it's not the kind of freedom that one person would regard as meaningful, because if I look at randomness in the universe, it's assumed that the notion of randomness is therefore meaningless. When we think about choice and the first person sense of having made a choice, because you can't think about choice in the third person or the second person sense, really. I mean, you experience choice in the first person. And so, and again, the notion of choice as being real is attached to the first person relationship. It's not something, I can't make choices yesterday or tomorrow. I can only make choices now. And so in this sense, when tomorrow is today, then I can make choices in that context. But the nowness is always the now. And so in this sense, there's a sort of recognition that, we can't hold the notion of choice or the notion of freedom as being connected to this sort of overarching model. It's really connected to the immediacy. And this, of course, is, observed when we think about freedom and limitation. The metaphysics, for example, as I write it, would say something along the lines of, well, for every limitation, there's two kinds of freedom. And for every freedom, there's two kinds of limitation. I say kinds because they're distinct. There's a true multiplicity in both directions. But that kind of freedom doesn't necessarily imply the same kind of meaningfulness that one feels inside when one's making a choice, like one's coordinating their actions with respect to their deep subjective intentions, all of which are unobservable. So there's a kind of meaningfulness that is known and felt and experienced in a subjective first-hand sense that is not experienced in looking at things that are random and coming from the outside as perceived. So in this particular sense, in the sense that science would only be able to describe things that are both observable and repeatable, i.e., if it's not repeatable, the kind of random sort of thing, then the notion of randomness is already outside of the field of science. And the notion of meaningfulness, in the sense that it's a subjective quality, which is not to say that it isn't real, it's just that it's already itself not observable. So therefore, the notion of freedom, in the sense of free will, is outside of the scope of science fundamentally, and therefore also out of the scope of mathematics. And so in that sense, this is just all the things that are happening before we even get to the notion of thinking about will. Right? Will would basically hold that the subjective was somehow more primary than the objective, or the relationship between self and objective. And so in that sense, there's a sort of reality here of the relationship between self and reality is more basic than both self and reality. So how is it that you're going to have self as a kind of conditionalization or control over reality, or even over the relationship between self and reality, when the relationship is more primary? So that the notion of will as a kind of dominance is itself a reflection of a sort of a cultural paradigm. It's very much a Western thing, Descartes, etc., talking about separation, first of all, and then in the sense that the master is, in a sense, going to dominate the slave, or it's going to dominate the situation, that we can actually have control in the universe. There's no such thing as control. Control is an illusion. It's like, you remember I referring earlier to that which is real contains choice, change, and causation together. But if I try to talk about control, I've already removed the element of choice. And so in that sense, control can't be a thing. It's like the idea that we could conditionalize anything in the universe to some sort of absolute degree, such that the universe itself can't participate in it, is just bogus. It's just not a thing. So we have degrees of influence. We can be in relationship, we can be in the flow, we can be in choice, and we can certainly engage with causation. But again, in the sense that causation is not going to be 100% deterministic ever. That the notion of will, of compelling something to happen, is just it's a false concept. So for all of these reasons, to talk about free and to talk about will, and then to combine these as if it's going to make some sort of magical meaningfulness in the sense of what we experience subjectively, is just, again, most philosophers look at this and find that notion to be completely incoherent. But usually they just stop at that point. They say, well, since choice and decision and free will are all the same thing, that therefore we have just rejected the notion of consciousness as having any influence on physical reality at all. And, staying with Descartes, that separation between mind and body is such that, having just disproven mind as a causal influence in the universe, therefore we can basically say that consciousness, if anything, is an epiphenomenon. And of course, this is all just junk, because it stems from a premise of separation and not the relationship as a unifying force in the first place. So this is largely part of the reason why, for example, that the metaphysics doesn't start with Cartesian separation as a premise. It starts with you have dualism as a sort of philosophical premise, and then you have physical monism. We just made that same transition because it's the same argument, i.e. that there's mind and body, and then they say, well, mind isn't anything, so we're going to let go of that. We've just disproven you can't observe mind, and so therefore it isn't real or it doesn't exist. And again, it's very slippery because they use these languages as kind of interchangeable, but they're not. So they end up overgeneralizing and proving too much. And so in effect, what ends up happening is that we end up having the idea that the physical universe is everything, and that humanity and machinery and nature are all the same, and therefore we might as well just do whatever we damn well want. And there's no such thing as want. We're all just machinery playing out in chemistry, and so there's no morality and there's no ethics to really think about. And of course, the whole thing goes out to some desacralized hedonism. With all the excesses of the universe as humanity currently thinks it's currently in place. But if we start from a different set of premises, the idea of foundational triplication and type isomorphism, i.e. that there's always these three sets of concepts at the basis of any domain, and that we can understand the relationship between these concepts in a way that's applicable to every domain, then it becomes possible to hold the notion of choice as being equal co-participant as the notion of causation and the notion of change. And that from this emerges an entirely different way of thinking about life, the universe, and everything. And that from that, we can actually start to have tools that would allow us to say, yes, choice is real, but it's just not the same as decision. It's not the same as free will. And of course, between the three of those, I'd rather have choice than anything else. So in this sense, there's just, again, I'm connecting these concepts to a whole bunch of other arguments in history and in time, and trying to sort of show how my holding of it is a little different than other holdings of this have been in the past.